The message arrived in waves, carried through every known communication channel like a slow, rolling tide. Static hissed briefly. Then the image emerged, a darkened void filled with fractured light, as though the stars themselves had been broken. A voice followed, cold and metallic, layered with a synthetic echo that amplified its authority. "This task carries a 99.9% fatality rate," it declared, each syllable deliberate and heavy. "Success will bring wealth, honor, and eternal recognition within the Galactic Empire. Failure ensures death. The choice is yours." The visuals flickered. The screen filled with images of desolation, alien landscapes scorched black, ships reduced to skeletal husks drifting in endless space, and the charred remains of beings unidentifiable yet hauntingly familiar. The voice cut through the silence again. "Our finest have fallen. We require something more." In an instant the broadcast ended. Yet its echoes lingered, resonating like an unshakable shadow in the minds of those who heard it. Across the galaxy there was silence, species recoiling at the sheer arrogance of such an invitation. But on Earth, it sparked something entirely different. Commander Elias Kane stood in the war room of Earth's Interstellar Command, arms folded, his scarred hands gripping his elbows as if tethering himself to the moment. The glow of the holographic screen cast harsh shadows across his angular face, illuminating the faded silver lines of old wounds etched into his skin. Behind him, a murmuring crowd of Earth's military elite, corporate heads, and civilian representatives exchanged heated whispers. "They're baiting us," muttered Drake Holloway, leaning back in his chair at the edge of the circular table. His sharp hazel eyes flicked toward Kane, seeking affirmation. "This isn't an invitation. It's a death sentence wrapped in shiny words." "They think we're expendable," Victor Cross added. His voice was a low rumble, his posture stiff as he stared intently at the frozen hologram of the broadcast. A man of precision, Victor's words rarely came without intent. Elias didn't respond immediately. He stared at the screen, eyes unblinking as if he were trying to unravel the puzzle hidden in those fleeting images of destruction. The scent of stale coffee lingered in the room, blending with the metallic tang of machinery humming faintly in the background. The weight of the Empire's challenge hung thick in the air, filling the silence with a kind of invisible gravity. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice a blade slicing through the tension. "This isn't about expendability. It's about opportunity." The murmurs ceased. All eyes turned to him. "Opportunity?" Drake scoffed, his tone laced with disbelief. "You heard the numbers. 99.9% fatality rate, Kane. That's not an opportunity. It's a grave." Elias turned, his green eyes sharp enough to cut steel. "Then we make it the Empire's grave." The room went still. Even the ambient hum seemed to fade. Elias Kane was not a man of reckless ambition, and when he spoke there was a weight to his words, a conviction that planted itself in the room like an immovable stone. Kai Menendez, seated on a nearby console, broke the silence with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sounds like a party. Count me in." "You're joking," Drake snapped, though there was no real venom in his tone. He was always the skeptic, but beneath his sharp words lay an unshakable loyalty. "I never joke about parties," Kai quipped, the corner of his mouth twitching. His hands played idly with the cuff of his jacket, but his eyes carried a spark of readiness. Victor finally leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing over his chest. "We don't even know what they want from us. They showed us destruction, promised us glory, and then left us to fill in the blanks. For all we know, this could be a trap." Elias paced, his boots echoing softly against the polished floor. He could almost feel the weight of the Empire's eyes on them. Even now, they weren't just watching, they were testing Earth, testing him. "They want us because we're new," Elias said, his voice quieter now, but no less sharp. "They think we're desperate, unpredictable, dangerous enough to try what their warriors wouldn't dare." "Or stupid enough," Drake muttered, though his tone lacked bite. The holographic screen shifted, revealing a map of the galaxy. Crossix, a name heavy with menace, blinked at the center. Surrounding it were warning markers and vague descriptors. Unstable environment, Class 5 wildlife, uncharted terrain. The hologram rotated, showing an ominous planet swathed in storms and violent gravitational fields. "This is what they want us to tackle," Elias said, gesturing to the display. "A planet that chews up fleets and spits out corpses." A faint smirk tugged at Kai's lips. "Well, when you put it that way—" Elias shot him a glance, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Then he turned back to the table, his expression hardening. "We're going because it's worth the risk. If we succeed, it's not just the glory, it's the leverage. The Empire needs us now. We show them what we're capable of, and suddenly humanity's seat at the table isn't a courtesy, it's a threat." Drake leaned forward, his skepticism tempered now by curiosity. "And if we fail?" "Then we die," Elias said simply, his voice carrying neither fear nor hesitation. The room fell silent again. This time it was Drake who broke it, sighing as he ran a hand through his graying hair. "Fine, but if I get eaten by something with more teeth than sense, I'm haunting you." Kai chuckled, clapping Drake on the back. "Don't worry, I'll make sure they don't find enough of you to haunt anyone." "Charming," Drake muttered, though his lips twitched in a reluctant smile. Victor, who had been studying the hologram intently, finally nodded. "I'll need to calibrate the long-range scanners for an environment like this. Acid storms will mess with targeting systems. And I'll need to upgrade the shielding," Kai added, pushing off the console. "If this thing breathes plasma, I want at least a shot at surviving it." Drake stood, rolling his shoulders. "I'll start mapping supply caches. No sense charging in blind." Elias watched them, his chest tightening, not with doubt, but with the weight of what was to come. He had chosen them for this, each for a reason. They were the best Earth had to offer, and they knew the risks. But beneath their camaraderie and determination, the unspoken question lingered, heavy and unyielding. Was this a fight they could even win? As the team dispersed to prepare, Elias remained by the hologram, staring at Crossix. The room felt colder now, the hum of the machinery sharper. The faint aroma of burned circuitry wafted in, mixing with the sterile air, a subtle reminder of the fragility of their technology against the unknown. "This is going to change everything," Elias murmured to himself. Behind him, Kai's voice floated in from the corridor. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he reached out, the hologram flickering under his touch, and whispered, "Let's hope it's worth it." Elias Kane stood alone in the dimly lit chamber, the holographic map of Crossix hovering before him like a specter. The planet seemed alive, its stormy swirls and jagged contours pulsating in a rhythmic glow that mirrored his own heartbeat. He stared at the image, its shifting details etching themselves into his mind. The air around him was heavy, carrying the faint hum of the holoprojector and the distant murmur of his team preparing for the mission. The door behind him hissed open, and the sharp clack of boots against metal broke the silence. Victor Cross entered, his movement precise as always, his shadow stretching long against the pale light. He paused, scanning the hologram before speaking in a voice as measured as his steps. "Still staring at the map, Commander?" Victor's tone was steady, his words carefully weighted. "You won't find its secrets by glaring at it." Elias exhaled through his nose, his lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. "Maybe not, but if I look at it long enough, I might find where the Empire lied to us." Victor's eyes narrowed, his posture straightening as though the suggestion added an extra layer of tension to his already rigid frame. "You think they're holding back? They didn't just broadcast this message out of desperation, Victor." Elias's voice was low, each syllable laced with a quiet intensity. "They did it because they needed someone expendable enough to try and fail, but dangerous enough to give them an edge if we succeed. That doesn't exactly inspire trust." Victor tilted his head, his sharp gaze flicking back to the hologram. "Then let's make sure we don't fail." Footsteps approached from the corridor. this time accompanied by the faint hum of an energy tool being idly spun in one hand. Kai Menendez entered with a casual swagger, his boots scuffing slightly against the polished floor. He flicked a glance between Elias and Victor, the corners of his mouth pulling into a smirk. "Are we brooding in here? Or is this the pre-mission pep talk I missed?" Kai's voice carried a lightness that was almost dissonant in the room's somber atmosphere, but his sharp eyes betrayed an underlying focus. "Just discussing how the Empire probably expects us to die," Victor said flatly, not missing a beat. Kai let out a low whistle, leaning lazily against the wall as he twirled the energy tool. "Well, they're not wrong about the odds, but hey, if we pull it off, drinks are on me, assuming drinks still exist wherever we end up." Elias gave him a sidelong glance. "We'll hold you to that." Kai's grin widened, but it faded slightly as his gaze lingered on the hologram. The room seemed colder now, the faint scent of coolant drifting in from the vents. Somewhere far off, the rhythmic clang of tools echoed, a reminder of the frantic preparations underway. Drake Holloway joined them moments later, a datapad tucked under one arm. His face was lined with the kind of weariness that came from years of dealing with impossible logistics, but his sharp wit remained intact. "Hope you're all ready for a dose of reality," he said, tapping the datapad. "I've been analyzing the supply lists and, surprise, surprise, the Empire didn't bother giving us half the gear we need for this mission. We're short on environmental shielding, our medical supplies are bare bones, and let's not even start on the ammunition reserves." Kai let out a soft laugh. "Sounds like they really rolled out the red carpet for us." "They want us desperate," Victor interjected, his voice like the edge of a blade. "Desperate people make mistakes." Elias turned from the hologram, his green eyes cutting through the dim light as they landed on Drake. "What's our contingency?" Drake exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the datapad. "I've identified some possible fallback points based on the limited data we've got. If we hit the acid storms or a wildlife cluster, we'll need to move fast and improvise. That's assuming the terrain doesn't collapse under us first." Elias nodded, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the information. "We'll need a backup for the backup. I don't like going in blind." "None of us do," Victor said quietly, his gaze fixed on the planet's ominous hologram. "But we've done worse with less." The faint sound of static crackled through the intercom, followed by the clipped voice of the mission coordinator from Earth Command. "Team Orion, final briefing in 5 minutes. Report to the hangar." The air in the room shifted, the weight of inevitability settling over them. Elias turned off the hologram with a flick of his wrist, the light dissolving into a void that felt heavier than the image itself. "Let's move," he said simply, his voice carrying the authority of a man who didn't need to repeat himself. The team made their way to the hangar, the corridors lined with the muted glow of emergency lights. The scent of engine oil and overheated circuits grew stronger with each step, mingling with the faint vibrations of the ship's systems coming online. The hum of activity in the hangar was almost deafening. Technicians shouting over the whir of machinery, sparks flying as welders patched up the Orion's outer hull, and the sharp clank of crates being loaded into the cargo bay. The Orion stood at the center of the chaos, a hulking beast of a ship with a battered exterior that spoke of countless battles survived. Its reinforced hull glinted faintly under the overhead lights, the scorch marks from previous missions still visible like scars. Kai let out a low whistle as he took in the sight. "She's not pretty, but she's ours." Drake shot him a look. "She's also barely holding together. If those storms are as bad as the reports, she won't last a day without constant repairs." "Then we keep her flying," Elias said firmly, his gaze sweeping the hangar. "If the Orion fails, so do we." As they approached the ship, the faint hum of the engine sent a vibration through the metal floor, resonating in their bones. The scent of ozone grew sharper as they entered the cargo bay, where crates of supplies were being secured by a small crew of technicians. One of them looked up briefly, offering a nod of respect before returning to his task. Victor stopped by the weapon racks, running a critical eye over the equipment. He selected a plasma rifle, testing its weight before securing it to his armor. "I've seen worse arsenals," he muttered, though his tone suggested it wasn't much of a compliment. Drake tapped at his datapad, his expression grim. "We're still short on shielding components. If the hull breaches—" "It won't," Elias interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "We've got this." Kai glanced over from where he was inspecting the pilot's controls. "I appreciate the confidence, Commander. Just remember, I'm the one flying us through hell." Elias's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Then you'd better be as good as you say you are." The team gathered at the base of the ramp, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. The faint hum of the Orion's engines grew louder, the vibrations intensifying as the ship powered up. Elias looked at each of them in turn, his gaze steady. "This isn't just a mission," he said, his voice low but carrying. "It's our chance to show the galaxy what we're capable of. We've faced worse odds before, and we came out on top. This time won't be any different." For a moment there was silence. Then Kai grinned, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Well, when you put it that way, let's go make some history." Elias turned, ascending the ramp with deliberate steps. Behind him the others followed, their expressions a mix of determination and grim anticipation. The Orion's ramp sealed shut with a hiss, and the ship shuddered slightly as it prepared for liftoff. As they settled into their positions, the silence in the cockpit was almost oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the navigation systems. Elias sat in the command chair, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond the viewport. The weight of the mission pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting, but he welcomed it. "Set course for Crossix," he ordered, his voice steady. "Let's see what they're so afraid of." The Orion ripped through the void of space, its reinforced hull trembling as it approached the violent atmosphere of Crossix. The planet loomed ahead, a swirling nightmare of green and black, its surface flickering with sporadic bursts of bioluminescent light. Lightning arced across the churning clouds, each strike illuminating jagged mountain ranges and rivers of molten rock below. The air inside the cockpit felt thick with tension, as if the oppressive weight of the planet had seeped through the walls. Elias Kane leaned forward in the captain's chair, his sharp eyes fixed on the chaotic world spinning below. His fingers rested lightly on the console, steady despite the turbulence shaking the ship. The muted glow from the navigation systems cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the hard lines of a man already bracing for the worst. "Gravity's shifting," Kai Menendez said from the pilot's seat, his voice taut but controlled. His hands moved deftly across the controls, adjusting the thrusters in quick, precise bursts. "We've got a serious flux ahead. If I don't hit this right, we're going to be a smear on their pretty alien landscape." "No pressure," Elias replied dryly, his tone laced with a faint edge of humor that didn't reach his eyes. Victor Cross stood at the rear of the cockpit, one hand braced against the wall as the ship jolted violently. He peered out the viewport, his expression unreadable as he studied the storm-racked surface. "I don't like it," he muttered, his deep voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the engines. "The storms, the terrain, it's too perfect, like it's designed to keep us out." "Or keep something in," Drake Holloway said from the console beside him, his gaze fixed on a scrolling feed of environmental data. His tone carried a trace of unease, a rare crack in his usually calm demeanor. "Acidic rain, magnetic disturbances, wildlife flagged as hostile on every level. I'm running out of ways to say we shouldn't be here." "We're here," Elias said sharply, not taking his eyes off the approaching surface. "So we deal with it." Victor stopped by the weapon racks, running a critical eye over the equipment. He selected a plasma rifle, testing its weight before securing it to his armor. "I've seen worse arsenals," he muttered, though his tone suggested it wasn't much of a compliment. Drake tapped at his datapad, his expression grim. "We're still short on shielding components. If the hull breaches—" "It won't," Elias interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "We've got this." Kai glanced over from where he was inspecting the pilot's controls. "I appreciate the confidence, Commander. Just remember, I'm the one flying us through hell." Elias's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Then you'd better be as good as you say you are." The team gathered at the base of the ramp, their movement synchronized like a well-oiled machine. The faint hum of the Orion's engines grew louder, the vibrations intensifying as the ship powered up. Elias looked at each of them in turn, his gaze steady. "This isn't just a mission," he said, his voice low but carrying. "It's our chance to show the galaxy what we're capable of. We've faced worse odds before, and we came out on top. This time won't be any different." For a moment there was silence. Then Kai grinned, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Well, when you put it that way, let's go make some history." Elias turned, ascending the ramp with deliberate steps. Behind him the others followed, their expressions a mix of determination and grim anticipation. The Orion's ramp sealed shut with a hiss, and the ship shuddered slightly as it prepared for liftoff. As they settled into their positions, the silence in the cockpit was almost oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the navigation systems. Elias sat in the command chair, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond the viewport. The weight of the mission pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting, but he welcomed it. "Set course for Crossix," he ordered, his voice steady. "Let's see what they're so afraid of." The Orion ripped through the void of space, its reinforced hull trembling as it approached the violent atmosphere of Crossix. The planet loomed ahead, a swirling nightmare of green and black, its surface flickering with sporadic bursts of bioluminescent light. Lightning arced across the churning clouds, each strike illuminating jagged mountain ranges and rivers of molten rock below. The air inside the cockpit felt thick with tension, as if the oppressive weight of the planet had seeped through the walls. Elias Kane leaned forward in the captain's chair, his sharp eyes fixed on the chaotic world spinning below. His fingers rested lightly on the console, steady despite the turbulence shaking the ship. The muted glow from the navigation systems cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the hard lines of a man already bracing for the worst. "Gravity's shifting," Kai Menendez said from the pilot's seat, his voice taut but controlled. His hands moved deftly across the controls, adjusting the thrusters in quick, precise bursts. "We've got a serious flux ahead. If I don't hit this right, we're going to be a smear on their pretty alien landscape." "No pressure," Elias replied dryly, his tone laced with a faint edge of humor that didn't reach his eyes. Victor Cross stood at the rear of the cockpit, one hand braced against the wall as the ship jolted violently. He peered out the viewport, his expression unreadable as he studied the storm-racked surface. "I don't like it," he muttered, his deep voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the engines. "The storms, the terrain, it's too perfect, like it's designed to keep us out." "Or keep something in," Drake Holloway said from the console beside him, his gaze fixed on a scrolling feed of environmental data. His tone carried a trace of unease, a rare crack in his usually calm demeanor. "Acidic rain, magnetic disturbances, wildlife flagged as hostile on every level. I'm running out of ways to say we shouldn't be here." "We're here," Elias said sharply, not taking his eyes off the approaching surface. "So we deal with it." The ship lurched violently, a deafening roar filling the cockpit as an electric storm engulfed them. The air seemed to vibrate with a high-pitched whine, static electricity crackling across the controls. Kai cursed under his breath, fighting the yoke as the Orion bucked like a living thing. The faint scent of burning circuits seeped into the air, sharp and acrid. "Hold her steady," Elias barked, gripping the armrests of his chair. "I'm trying," Kai snapped, sweat beading on his forehead as he yanked the controls. "But this storm's got a mean streak. It's like flying through a blender." The viewport lit up with a blinding flash as a bolt of green lightning struck dangerously close to the hull. For a moment, the cockpit was bathed in an eerie glow, shadows twisting across the walls like living things. The air seemed to crackle with energy, a visceral charge that set every nerve on edge. "Shields are holding," Drake said. Though his voice lacked its usual confidence, his fingers danced across the console, recalibrating systems faster than they could fail. "But they won't last if we take a direct hit." "Then don't let us take one," Elias said coldly, his gaze still locked on the storm. Kai muttered something under his breath, his hands flying across the controls as he threaded the ship through the chaos. Each movement felt like a gamble, the violent winds threatening to tear them apart at any moment. The engines roared in protest, the vibrations rattling the floor beneath their feet. "Visual on the landing zone," Victor said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. He pointed toward a faint clearing that appeared between two jagged cliffs, its edges glowing faintly with bioluminescent moss. "It's tight, but it's the only spot clear enough to set down." Kai glanced at the display, his jaw tightening. "You call that clear? Those cliffs are alive." Elias frowned, leaning forward for a better look. Sure enough, the towering cliffs seemed to shift and ripple, their surfaces covered in massive, slow-moving creatures that blended seamlessly with the terrain. The creatures' leathery hides glistened under the acidic rain, their movements sluggish but deliberate. "Living mountains," Drake muttered, shaking his head. "Of course. Can you land us there or not?" Elias asked, his tone cutting through the noise. Kai hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "I can land us anywhere. Just don't expect the ship to look pretty afterward." Elias's lips twitched into a faint smile. She wasn't pretty to begin with. The Orion descended rapidly, the ship groaning under the strain as it maneuvered through the tight canyon. The storm raged around them, acidic rain pelting the hull with a hiss that sounded almost alive. The air grew denser, the oppressive heat of the planet seeping into the cockpit despite the ship's reinforced barriers. "Brace for impact," Kai called out, his voice tight with focus. The landing was rough, the ship skidding across the uneven ground before coming to a jolting stop. A plume of steam hissed up from the landing gear, the acrid stench of scorched metal filling the air. The crew sat in tense silence for a moment, the sounds of the storm muffled but still menacing. "Well," Kai said, leaning back with a shaky grin, "we're alive. That's a good start." Elias stood, his movements deliberate, as he surveyed the team. "Victor, take point. Drake, stay with the ship and monitor the systems. If this place tries to kill us, and it will, I want to know about it before it happens." Victor nodded, already securing his rifle. The faint hum of its charge filled the cockpit, a low and steady reminder of the dangers ahead. Drake sighed but didn't argue, settling into his seat with a resigned expression. Elias led the team down the ramp, the hiss of the hydraulics barely audible over the storm. The acidic rain hit their armor with a sharp sizzle, the faint smell of sulfur mingling with the metallic tang of the atmosphere. The ground beneath their boots was soft and unstable, shifting slightly with each step as though the planet itself was alive. "Stay sharp," Elias said, his voice low but firm. "This place isn't going to give us a warm welcome." The clearing was eerily silent, the bioluminescent moss casting an otherworldly glow that illuminated the jagged rocks around them. The cliffs loomed high above, their shifting surfaces creating an unsettling illusion of movement. The air was thick, each breath carrying the faint taste of something metallic and unnatural. Victor raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. He crouched low, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain ahead. The faint sound of chittering reached their ears, a dry, rasping noise that sent a shiver down their spines. "Contact," Victor murmured, his voice barely audible. Elias followed his gaze, his hand instinctively tightening around his weapon. In the distance, shadows moved against the bioluminescent glow, their forms indistinct but unnervingly quick. The chittering grew louder, the sound multiplying as more shapes emerged from the darkness. "Gravon swarm," Drake's voice crackled over the comms. "They blend into the terrain until they're right on top of you. You've got maybe 30 seconds before they close in." "Move," Elias barked, his voice cutting through the rising tension. The team broke into a run, their boots pounding against the unstable ground as the swarm descended. The air filled with the sound of skittering claws and clicking mandibles, the creatures moving with unnatural speed. Their bodies glistened with bioluminescent patterns, making them both mesmerizing and terrifying. Victor turned, his rifle spitting bright plasma bursts into the darkness. The sharp crack of the shots echoed through the clearing, the glowing forms of the Gravons collapsing as they were hit. But for every one that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. "We're outnumbered," Victor growled, his tone tight but calm. Keep moving, Elias ordered, his voice unwavering. The cliffs are our only chance. As they neared the towering formations, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. The Grovons hesitated, their movements faltering as the tremors grew stronger. Elias glanced back, his sharp gaze narrowing as he spotted something massive stirring in the darkness. "Something's coming," he muttered, his tone grim. "And it's not friendly." The ground beneath them trembled, the vibrations rattling up through their boots as though the planet itself was warning them to leave. Elias Kane kept his stance steady, his eyes scanning the jagged cliffs ahead, while his ears strained to track the distant chittering of the Gravon swarm. Somewhere in the shadows behind them, something immense stirred, its movements deep and deliberate, sending waves of unease through the team. "We need to keep moving," Elias ordered, his voice sharp against the storm's howl. The acidic rain intensified, hissing as it struck the rocky terrain, carrying a metallic stench that clung to the air. Each drop seemed to corrode the world around them, leaving steaming craters in the moss-covered ground. Victor Cross took the lead, his plasma rifle steady in his hands. He moved with the precision of a predator, his eyes cutting through the bioluminescent haze for threats. "If that thing back there gets any closer, moving won't matter," he muttered, his voice low but clear. Behind him, Kai Menendez adjusted his grip on his carbine, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips despite the tension. "What's the plan, Commander? Run, fight, or negotiate with whatever's trying to eat us?" Elias didn't answer immediately. His gaze flicked back toward the darkness where the Gravons swarmed, their clicking and skittering a chaotic symphony that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. The sound of massive footsteps joined the din, each one a thunderous boom that shook the ground and made the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. "Run!" Elias said finally, his voice calm but firm. "To the cliffs. Now!" Kai let out a low whistle, his tone laced with grim amusement. "Running it is. Can't wait to see how that turns out." The team surged forward, their boots crunching against loose gravel and wet moss. The cliffs loomed closer, their immense forms shifting as if alive, the creatures clinging to their surfaces, blending seamlessly into the jagged rock. The bioluminescent glow grew brighter here, casting eerie green and blue hues across the terrain, as if the cliffs themselves were alive and watching. Victor raised his fist, signaling them to halt as he crouched low. His sharp eyes tracked movement near the base of the cliffs. "We're not alone," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm's roar. Elias crouched beside him, his gaze following Victor's line of sight. Shadows moved along the cliffside, large and deliberate. They weren't Gravens. These forms were too solid, too calculated. For a moment, the storm's fury seemed to dull, replaced by an unnatural silence. Then the shadows stepped into the light. They were humanoid, but only in shape. Their bodies glinted like polished obsidian, smooth and reflective, with faint lines of glowing energy running through their limbs like veins. Their heads were adorned with intricate helms, featureless, save for two pinpricks of red light where eyes should have been. Each carried a weapon that crackled faintly, with an energy that hummed against the senses. "Guardians," Victor said, his voice grim. "They don't look friendly." "They're not here to welcome us," Elias replied, already assessing their options. The Guardians moved with an eerie precision, their movements smooth and mechanical, yet somehow unnervingly organic. They seemed to flow across the terrain, their weapons raised and pointed directly at the team. Kai exhaled sharply, raising his carbine. "Well, they've got great posture, I'll give them that." "Focus!" Elias snapped. He gestured toward a narrow crevice in the cliffside just ahead, its entrance barely visible against the moss-covered rock. "We make for that opening. Drake, status?" Drake's voice crackled over the comms, laced with static. "The ship's holding, but those Gravens are getting bolder. You're going to have company if you don't move." "Noted," Elias said, cutting the channel. He turned to the others, his voice low and steady. "On my mark, we move. Victor, take point. Kai, cover our rear. Aim for their joints. They're biomechanical, so they'll have weaknesses." Victor nodded, his rifle already raised. "Ready?" The first Guardian lunged forward, its weapon discharging a searing beam of light that narrowly missed Victor's head and slammed into the ground behind him, sending a shower of molten rock into the air. The air filled with the acrid stench of burned stone, mingling with the storm's sulphurous tang. "Move!" Elias barked, his own weapon roaring to life as he fired a burst of plasma at the nearest Guardian. The glowing round struck its chest, leaving scorch marks but failing to stop its advance. Victor's shot followed a moment later, aimed directly at the creature's knee joint. The Guardian staggered, its movements faltering as the energy lines in its leg flickered. The team sprinted toward the crevice, their movements fluid and practiced despite the chaos around them. The Guardians pursued, their heavy footfalls reverberating through the ground like drumbeats. Each shot they fired filled the air with a blinding light and a deafening crack, the heat searing against the team's exposed skin. Kai turned mid-stride, his carbine spitting rapid bursts of plasma at the advancing enemies. "You'd think something that shiny wouldn't take this much effort to kill," he shouted, his voice tinged with exasperation. Elias didn't respond, his focus locked on the crevice ahead. They were close now, the opening just wide enough to offer cover but narrow enough to funnel their attackers. He raised his weapon, firing another burst that struck the Guardian closest to Victor, giving him the split second he needed to reach the crevice. Victor ducked inside, his rifle already trained on the entrance. "Clear!" he called out. Kai and Elias followed, their movements quick and purposeful. As soon as they were inside, Elias turned, his eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of additional threats. The Guardians halted at the crevice's edge, their glowing eyes fixed on the team with an intensity that felt almost sentient. "They're not following," Kai said, his voice quieter now but still laced with tension. "Why aren't they following?" Elias didn't answer immediately. The air inside the crevice was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. The walls were smooth, almost unnaturally so, with faint patterns etched into the stone that pulsed faintly in the dim light. "They don't need to," Elias said finally, his voice low. "They're hurting us." Victor frowned, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Toward what?" The answer came in the form of a distant rumble, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the cliffs. It was low and resonant, vibrating through the rock and into their bones. The patterns on the walls pulsed brighter, their glow synchronizing with the sound in an unsettling rhythm. "This just keeps getting better," Kai muttered, his voice thick with sarcasm. Elias stepped deeper into the crevice, his eyes narrowing as he studied the glowing patterns. They weren't random. They were deliberate, forming symbols and shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. His fingers brushed against the stone, and it was warm to the touch, almost alive. "Drake," Elias said over the comms, "we've entered some kind of structure. Get me everything you can on the cliff's composition and any energy signatures nearby." "Copy that," Drake replied, his voice tight with focus. "But you'd better hurry. Those Gravens aren't waiting for an invitation." Elias glanced back at his team, his expression grim. "Stay sharp. Whatever's ahead, it's not going to be friendly." As the rumble grew louder, the faint sound of mechanical whirring joined it, echoing through the narrow passage like a distant scream. The walls pulsed brighter, casting shifting shadows across the team's faces. The air seemed to hum, charged with an energy that set every nerve on edge. Kai's voice broke the tense silence. "I don't suppose we could just turn around and ask those Guardians for directions?" Elias's lips twitched into a faint smirk, but his eyes remained fixed on the path ahead. "Let's find out what they're protecting." The rumble grew louder, evolving into a tremor that seemed to pulse through the walls, vibrating against the team's armor. Elias Kane pressed forward, his boots crunching against the fine, brittle shards of stone beneath him. The glowing glyphs along the walls writhed, their patterns shifting with a hypnotic rhythm that made his stomach twist. The air had grown colder, each breath carrying a sharp metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. Victor Cross moved ahead, his plasma rifle sweeping the narrowing passage. The steady hum of the weapon seemed muted here, swallowed by the unsettling hum of the structure itself. "This isn't just a cave," he murmured, his voice low but edged with unease. "It's alive. Alive or not, it's leading us somewhere," Elias replied, his voice steady. He touched the wall lightly, the heat beneath the surface prickling his fingers like a faint electric charge. "And it's not giving us a choice." Kai Menendez trailed behind, his steps unusually cautious. "Anyone else feel like we're the mice in a really bad experiment? Because I swear, if a giant trapdoor drops—" "Focus," Elias cut in, his tone sharp. His gaze locked on the faint glow ahead, a pale blue light spilling into the passage from some unseen source. It flickered like distant lightning, its irregular rhythm mirroring the pulse in his ears. As they stepped closer, the passage opened into a cavernous chamber. The ceiling disappeared into shadow, the glow of the glyphs casting jagged patterns across the walls. The faint scent of something burnt, ozone mixed with charred metal, wafted through the air. At the center of the room, an enormous pedestal rose from the ground, its surface carved with intricate designs that seemed to shift when viewed too closely. And atop the pedestal was the artifact. It was smaller than Elias had expected, a crystalline orb no larger than a man's fist. Its surface shimmered with a fluid, iridescent glow, as if a storm had been trapped inside. The faint hum that filled the chamber seemed to emanate from the artifact itself, each pulse of light accompanied by a subtle vibration that resonated in the bones. Victor moved cautiously toward the pedestal, his weapon raised. "This is it," he said, his voice a mix of awe and suspicion. "What they sent us here to die for." Kai tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Doesn't look like much. All this trouble for a fancy paperweight?" Drake's voice crackled over the comms. "That paperweight is putting out energy spikes that make no sense. It's like it's pulling power from the planet itself." "Careful," Elias warned, his eyes narrowing as Victor stepped closer. "If this thing is connected to the planet, taking it could set off a chain reaction. Or trigger something worse," Victor added grimly, his movements deliberate as he studied the pedestal. "Glyphs are different here. Look, these aren't warnings. They're instructions." Elias joined him, his eyes scanning the carvings. The glyphs formed a spiral pattern, their lines flowing into the artifact like rivers converging into a single point. "A mechanism," he murmured. "The pedestal isn't just holding it, it's locking it in place." "Like a key," Victor said, his tone sharpening. "And we're about to turn it." Kai snorted softly, his weapon still trained on the dark edges of the chamber. "Great. Nothing says safe like unlocking an alien superweapon in the middle of a death trap." Elias glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "We came here to retrieve it. That hasn't changed." Victor hesitated, his fingers hovering over the pedestal's base. "If this thing is what the Empire wants, why didn't they send more resources? More people?" "Because they don't expect us to come back," Elias said coldly. He turned away, opening the comms channel. "Drake, any sign of movement outside?" "Yeah," Drake replied, his voice clipped. "Those Guardians aren't just standing there anymore. They're converging toward your location. And the Gravons aren't far behind." "Time's up," Elias said. "Victor, do it." Victor exhaled sharply and placed his hand on the pedestal. The glyphs pulsed brighter, their glow intensifying as the artifact began to shift. A low hum filled the chamber, rising into a piercing whine that made the air vibrate. The orb lifted slowly from its cradle, its light flaring so brightly that the team had to shield their eyes. Then the chamber fell silent. The artifact floated in midair, its glow softening but no less mesmerizing. Victor reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing against its surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the walls began to tremble. Kane?" Kai's voice was tight, his eyes darting around the chamber. "I think we just hit the wrong button." The glyphs along the walls flared to life, their patterns spinning and twisting into chaotic shapes. The hum returned, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of grinding stone. The ground shook violently, sending cracks spidering across the floor. Elias grabbed the artifact, his fingers closing around its warm, pulsing surface. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy coursed through him, sharp and electric, like lightning in his veins. Images flashed in his mind. Blinding light, alien landscapes, and a war that spanned the stars. He staggered back, his breath ragged. "What the hell was that?" Victor demanded, his eyes darting to Elias. Elias shook his head, his grip tightening on the artifact. "Later, move." The team sprinted back toward the passage, the chamber collapsing behind them as chunks of stone rained down. The sound of whirring machinery grew louder, and the Guardians reappeared, their red eyes glowing like beacons in the chaos. They moved faster now, their weapons glowing with an intensity that promised annihilation. Kai fired first, his carbine spitting plasma that struck one of the Guardians in the chest. The impact staggered it, but the machine didn't fall. "These things just don't quit," he shouted, his voice echoing through the passage. "Keep moving," Elias barked, firing over his shoulder. The plasma bolt struck another Guardian, its arm jerking violently as the energy disrupted its systems. The team reached the crevice's entrance just as a deafening roar filled the air. The Gravons had arrived, their swarm pouring through the cliffs like a living wave of shadow and teeth. The two threats clashed violently, the Guardians cutting through the Gravons with surgical precision, while the creatures swarmed over them in a frenzy. Elias didn't stop to watch. "Drake, we're on our way back. Prep the ship for immediate departure." "Already on it," Drake replied. "But we've got a problem. I'm picking up Imperial ships entering the atmosphere. They're not here to help." Elias swore under his breath, his mind racing. The Empire's betrayal wasn't a surprise, but the timing was brutal. "Hold them off as long as you can. We'll be there in 5. "Make it 3, Drake shot back, his voice tight with urgency. The team emerged into the open, the storm raging around them. The Gravons and Guardians tore into each other behind them, their battle a cacophony of screeches and metallic clangs. Above, the sky churned with green lightning, the faint outlines of Imperial ships cutting through the clouds. Elias clutched the artifact tightly, its glow piercing through the storm. His heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "Let's finish this." The storm clawed at them, its winds tearing like invisible talons as the team sprinted toward the Orion. Acidic rain hissed against their armor, releasing a foul stench that mixed with the metallic tang of the artifact Elias Kane clutched tightly in his hands. Its iridescent glow pulsed with a disquieting rhythm, casting jagged shadows across their faces as the chaos intensified around them. Ahead, the Orion loomed like a battered sentinel, its landing lights cutting through the storm in uneven beams. Drake Holloway's voice crackled over the comms, jagged with interference. "The Gravons are closing in fast. Shields are holding, but not for long." "They're not our only problem," Elias snapped, his eyes lifting to the sky. The Imperial ships had descended, sleek and angular silhouettes cutting through the roiling clouds. Their weapons hummed with ominous energy, the faint whine growing louder as they prepared to fire. Victor Cross moved beside him, his rifle raised, the glow of his plasma rounds lighting up the rain as he fired into the approaching Gravons. "We're boxed in," he growled, his voice steady but tense. "Storm behind us, Gravons below, and the Empire above." Kai Menendez spun mid-run, his carbine spitting rapid bursts into the swarm that surged from the cliffs. The creatures fell in writhing heaps, their bioluminescent markings flickering like dying embers. "Great! Just the kind of welcoming committee I love." Elias glanced back at the battle raging behind them. The Guardians and Gravons were locked in a brutal, chaotic dance of destruction, their clashes sending shockwaves through the unstable ground. He could see fractures spreading across the terrain, glowing fissures that seemed ready to swallow them whole. The planet was unraveling, its fury stoked by the artifact's power. "Drake!" Elias barked into the comm, his breath harsh. "Bring the turrets online. Focus on clearing the path to the ramp." "Already working on it," Drake replied, his tone clipped. "But you're not going to like what's heading your way." A deafening roar split the air, drowning out the storm's howls. From the shadows of the cliffs emerged a monstrous Gravon, easily 3 times the size of its kin. Its translucent carapace shimmered with acid-green veins, and its segmented legs struck the ground like thunder. The creature's mandibles clicked in a rhythm that felt like a countdown, its multifaceted eyes reflecting the team in unsettling detail. Victor's rifle snapped up instantly, and he fired a precise shot at one of the creature's glowing veins. The plasma bolt struck true, searing through the carapace, but the Gravon barely faltered. It lunged forward, its claws gouging deep furrows into the ground as it closed the distance. "Fall back!" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the rising cacophony. The team moved as one, their steps precise even on the slick, treacherous ground. The Orion's turrets roared to life, their automated systems tracking the giant Gravon. Streams of plasma lit up the storm, slamming into the creature with explosive force. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning chitin, and the beast let out a guttural shriek that reverberated in their bones. "Nice shot!" Kai called out, his voice tinged with relief as he fired into the smaller Graven still swarming toward them. "Don't thank me yet," Drake interjected over the comm. "The big one's still moving." Elias reached the base of the Orion's ramp, his chest heaving as he turned to cover the others. The artifact throbbed in his hands, its glow intensifying as if responding to the danger. The vibrations it sent through his arms were almost unbearable, like holding a live wire that threatened to burn through his skin. "Kai, get to the cockpit and prep for liftoff," Elias ordered, shoving the artifact into a containment field mounted near the ramp. Its light dimmed slightly as the field activated, the containment systems humming with strain. "Victor, stay with me." "Drake, status on those Imperial ships?" "They're circling," Drake replied, "but they're not engaging. It's like they're waiting for us to die first." "Not today," Elias muttered, his eyes narrowing. The massive Gravon reared back, its mandibles opening wide to reveal a glowing organ deep within its chest. The light there pulsated ominously, and Elias's instinct screamed at him to move. "Victor, now!" Victor fired again, this time aiming for the Graven's exposed underbelly. His plasma round struck the glowing organ, causing it to rupture in a burst of green ichor. The creature screamed, its body convulsing as the acidic liquid sprayed across the ground, eating through rock and moss with terrifying speed. The Gravon collapsed, its massive form twitching before finally going still. The smaller creatures hesitated, their movements faltering as if thrown into disarray by the loss of their leader. "Clear the ramp," Elias barked, covering the others as they scrambled aboard the Orion. The ship shuddered beneath them, its systems groaning under the strain of the storm and the damage it had already sustained. Kai's voice crackled over the comm. "Engines online, but if we're leaving, we need to do it now." "Victor, get to the guns," Elias ordered. "Drake, plot an escape route through the storm." "I'm working on it," Drake shot back. "But that artifact's messing with our sensors. It's like trying to navigate through static." Elias gritted his teeth, his mind racing. The artifact's power was growing more volatile, its energy spilling into the ship's systems despite the containment field. He could feel it in the air, a subtle charge that made every hair on his body stand on end. "We don't have time for precision," Elias said. "Kai, take us up. Victor, keep the Guardians and the Gravens off us." The Orion lifted off with a violent lurch, the engines roaring against the storm's fury. The ship swayed as Kai fought to stabilize it, his hands flying across the controls with practiced precision. Below, the battle between the Guardians and Gravons raged on, the ground splintering under the weight of their conflict. Elias stood at the command console, his eyes fixed on the Imperial ships circling above. They weren't firing, but their presence was a threat that couldn't be ignored. "Victor, keep an eye on those Imperials. If they make a move, I want them neutralized." "Understood," Victor replied, his tone as sharp as the crack of his plasma rounds. As the Orion broke through the storm's upper layers, the turbulence lessened, giving the team a brief reprieve. The air in the cockpit was thick with tension, each breath heavy with the unspoken realization that their ordeal was far from over. Elias turned to the artifact, its glow muted but no less ominous within the containment field. It seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, a silent reminder of the power they had unleashed. "What now?" Kai asked from the pilot's seat, his voice unusually subdued. Elias didn't answer immediately. He stared at the artifact, his mind replaying the images it had burned into his thoughts, the war, the destruction, the question it had posed. Finally he looked up, his green eyes steely with resolve. "Now," he said, We figure out what the Empire's hiding and make sure they regret sending us here." The Orion pierced the storm's upper boundary, emerging into the thin, turbulent air of Crossix's stratosphere. The view beyond the viewport was an unsettling juxtaposition of fleeting calm and looming menace. The storm churned below, a cauldron of fury, while above the Imperial ships hung in disciplined formation, their sleek hulls reflecting faint flashes of green lightning. Elias Kane stood at the command console, his hands braced against its edges as he studied the tactical display. Each ship was marked by a sharp red indicator, the proximity alarms pinging softly. His jaw clenched as he watched their positioning. The Empire wasn't engaging, not yet, but their predatory circling spoke louder than any shot fired. "They're waiting," Elias said, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the cockpit, "watching us burn fuel, testing our movements. They don't want to fight. They want us desperate." Victor Cross's voice came through from the gunnery station, steady as ever. "Then let's give them something to watch. The turrets are charged and ready. Just say the word." Elias shook his head. "Not yet. They have the numbers, and they know it. If we fire now, we're playing into their hands." Kai Menendez swiveled slightly in the pilot's seat, his fingers flicking across the controls with practiced precision. "So, what's the plan, Commander? Because hovering here while they stare us down doesn't exactly scream survival." Elias's gaze flicked to the containment field housing the artifact. Its glow had dimmed, but the faint pulse of its energy seemed to reverberate through the ship's systems. It was a ticking time bomb, and they all knew it. "They don't want the artifact damaged," Elias said slowly, the gears in his mind turning. "That's why they're holding back. We're carrying something they don't fully understand, and they're afraid of what might happen if we turn it on them." Drake Holloway's voice crackled over the comms from engineering. "Afraid or not, they've got the firepower to turn us into scrap if they change their minds. We need a way out, and fast." Elias straightened, his eyes narrowing as an idea began to take shape. "Kai, how much thrust can we divert into a controlled burn without blowing the engines?" Kai frowned, his hands hovering over the controls. "Depends how controlled you want it. The Orion's not exactly in her prime, but I can give you a short burst. Enough to look dangerous." "Good," Elias said. "Victor, prep the starboard turrets for a low-powered sweep. I want it to look like we're aiming to disable their lead ship, not destroy it." Victor hesitated. "That's a gamble. If they think we're taking a shot—" "They won't," Elias interrupted. "Not if we make it clear that we're holding the artifact as leverage." Kai let out a low whistle. "So we're bluffing with the galaxy's deadliest poker chip? Love it." Drake's voice carried a hint of skepticism. "And when the bluff doesn't work?" Elias's expression hardened. "It will, because we're not just bluffing." He turned to the artifact, its glow casting faint, shifting patterns across the console. "Drake, can we siphon a controlled discharge from the artifact into the ship's external systems?" Drake's reply was immediate. "You want me to run unfiltered alien energy through a barely functional hull? That's insane." "It's necessary," Elias said firmly. "We don't need a full discharge, just enough to show them we're willing to use it." The line went silent for a moment before Drake exhaled heavily. "I can rig something, but if it backfires, you're looking at a very short ride." "Then don't let it backfire," Elias said, his voice steady. He turned to Kai. "Get us into position, close enough to make them nervous, but not enough to provoke a full response." The Orion shuddered as its thrusters fired, the engines groaning under the strain. Kai guided the ship with surgical precision, weaving through the shifting currents of the upper atmosphere toward the lead Imperial vessel. The sleek warship loomed ahead, its weapons arrays glowing faintly as they tracked the Orion's approach. Victor's voice came through, calm but sharp. "Turrets ready, targeting their main propulsion. I can fire on your command." "Hold," Elias said, his eyes locked on the tactical display. "Drake, status?" The comms crackled. Then Drake's voice returned, tinged with irritation. "Energy routing is set. You've got about 10 seconds of controlled discharge before the system fries itself. Or us." "That's all we'll need," Elias said. He activated the external comms, his voice taking on a commanding edge. "Imperial fleet, this is Commander Elias Kane of the Orion. You've made your intentions clear, and so will we." The silence that followed was suffocating, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Then a response came, the clipped, precise voice of the Imperial fleet captain cutting through the static. "Orion, you are in possession of a classified asset belonging to the Galactic Empire. Surrender it immediately, and your lives will be spared. Resistance will result in your annihilation." Elias allowed himself a grim smile. "If you wanted it that badly, you shouldn't have sent us to retrieve it." He glanced at Drake's display. "Activate the discharge. Now." The artifact's glow flared, its energy surging through the ship's systems. The Orion's external plating lit up with crackling arcs of blue-white light, the atmosphere around it distorting in rippling waves. A low, resonant hum filled the air, accompanied by a faint vibration that made the entire vessel feel alive. Victor fired the turrets, a controlled burst that streaked past the Imperial lead ship's hull, close enough to scorch its shields but not penetrate. The combination of the artifact's power and the calculated attack sent a clear message. They were willing to use it. The Imperial fleet hesitated. Their formation wavered, the ship shifting uneasily in response to the display of force. For a moment, it seemed the gamble had paid off. Then the lead ship fired. The Orion's shields flared under the impact, the ship jolting violently as the cockpit lights flickered. Kai cursed, his hands flying over the controls to stabilize the vessel. "They're calling the bluff," Victor shouted, his voice sharp over the comms. Elias gritted his teeth. "Drake, reroute all power to shields. Kai, get us into the storm." Kai shot him a look. "You want to hide in that death trap?" "They won't follow us," Elias said. "Not with the artifact at risk." "Do it!" The Orion dove toward the storm, the engines screaming as Kai pushed them to their limits. The Imperial ships pursued briefly, their weapons lighting up the atmosphere with searing bolts of plasma. But as the Orion plunged into the storm's maelstrom, the enemy hesitated. The ship rocked violently, the turbulence threatening to tear it apart. Lightning arced across the hull, illuminating the cockpit in harsh, blinding flashes. The storm's roar was deafening, a constant barrage of sound that made every word a shout. "Drake!" Elias called out. "How long can the shields hold?" "Not long," Drake replied, his voice strained. "But if the artifact's energy stabilizes, we might have a shot at riding this out." Elias glanced at the containment field. The artifact's glow had dimmed again, but its pulse was steady, almost soothing. It was as if the storm itself was feeding it, or vice versa. "Victor," Elias said, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "Be ready. This isn't over." Victor's response was a simple, resolute, "Always." The Orion bucked violently as the storm surged around it, the furious winds battering the ship like an unseen leviathan. Lightning crackled across the viewports, blinding flashes that illuminated the desperate faces of the crew. Elias Kane stood firm at the command console, his knuckles white as they gripped the edges. The ship trembled beneath him, groaning under the relentless pressure, and the artifact pulsed in its containment field, casting eerie, shifting light across the cockpit. "We can't stay in this storm much longer," Kai Menendez shouted from the pilot's seat, his voice strained as he fought the controls. "Engines are running hot, and the shields are on their last legs." Victor Cross's voice came over the comms, calm but clipped. "The Imperials haven't followed us in. Either they're afraid, or they're waiting for the storm to do their work." Elias's jaw tightened, his mind racing through possibilities. The storm was their only refuge, but it was also their executioner. Every second here was borrowed time, and he could feel the clock ticking down. The artifact throbbed again, its energy rippling through the ship, sending flickers of power surging across the systems. Drake Holloway's voice crackled through the comms from engineering. "Containment is slipping. If that thing surges again, it'll fry every system we've got left, including life support." Elias turned to the artifact, its crystalline surface shimmering with unnatural light. It seemed to hum, almost like a heartbeat, steady but insistent. He could feel its power resonating in his chest, a weight that pressed against his thoughts like an unseen hand. It was alive, in some way he couldn't fully understand, and it was waiting for something, or someone. Drake, Elias said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the chaos. What happens if we let the artifact's energy flow unrestricted? Drake's reply was immediate, his tone sharp. It'll overload everything. The ship, the storm, hell, maybe even the planet. You're talking about unleashing a contained supernova. Would it take out the Imperial fleet? Elias asked, his green eyes locked on the pulsing orb. Drake hesitated. Probably. But it's not a controlled weapon, Commander. There's no way to aim it. You could vaporize the fleet or ignite something even worse. Victor's voice broke in, cold and precise. And us? No guarantees, Drake said, his words weighted with finality. Elias let the silence hang, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. The storm raged louder, the ship creaking under its unrelenting assault. Every instinct screamed at him to find another way, a safer path. But there was no safety left, only the thin line between survival and annihilation. We didn't come here to survive, Elias said finally, his voice quiet but unyielding. We came here to show them what we're capable of. Kai turned in his seat, his face pale but defiant. So what? We go out in a blaze of glory, prove we're the craziest species in the galaxy? Elias's gaze didn't waver. We prove we're more than that. We prove we're willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to make them afraid of what we can become. Victor's voice was a low rumble, steady as a drumbeat. Then let's give them a reason to remember us. Drake's sigh came through the comms, weary but resolute. I'll reroute containment to the external systems. When the artifact blows, it's going to take everything with it. Not everything, Elias said, his tone softer now. Kai, get us into position. We need to be close enough to draw them in, but far enough that the blast clears the storm. Kai's fingers moved across the controls, his movements fluid despite the tremor in his hands. You know, for a guy who doesn't like gambling, you've got a hell of a way of rolling the dice. Elias allowed himself a faint smile. This isn't a gamble. It's a choice. The Orion surged forward, its engines screaming against the turbulence. The storm seemed to fight them with every inch, the winds howling like a living thing desperate to consume them. The Imperial fleet loomed closer, their ships holding position at the storm's edge like predators circling wounded prey. Victor's voice broke the tense silence. Lead ship's weapons are hot. They're waiting for us to clear the storm before they fire. They won't get the chance, Elias said. He turned to the artifact, its light intensifying as if it had hurt him. Drake now. The ship shuddered as the containment field dropped, the artifact's energy spilling into the systems like a tidal wave. The lights flickered wildly, the air crackling with static electricity that prickled against their skin. The hum of the artifact rose into a keening wail, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Kai's voice was tight, almost breathless. We're glowing like a damn star, Commander. If this doesn't scare them off... It's not meant to, Elias interrupted. Victor, open a channel. The comms clicked, and Elias's voice carried out into the void, calm and unwavering. Imperial fleet, this is the Orion. You wanted proof of what we can do. Watch closely. The artifact's light exploded outward, a cascading wave of energy that surged through the ship and into the storm. The clouds convulsed, their violent churn turning into a blinding vortex of light and heat. The Imperial ships hesitated, their formation faltering as the energy rippled toward them, unstoppable and unrelenting. Elias's voice dropped, almost a whisper. Kai, full burn. Get us out of the blast radius. The Orion's engines roared to life, propelling the ship forward with a desperate surge of power. The cockpit vibrated violently, every system screaming in protest as the storm's fury closed in behind them. The artifact's light consumed everything, a supernova in miniature that tore through the storm and lashed out at the Imperial fleet. Victor's voice came through, sharp but steady. Impact in 3, 2. The blast hit with a force that defied comprehension. The Imperial ships crumpled under the wave, their sleek forms disintegrating into glowing fragments that scattered like dying stars. The storm collapsed inward, its energy devoured by the artifact's final surge. The Orion hurtled forward, its hull groaning under the strain as Kai wrestled with the controls. The cockpit lights dimmed, then flared back to life as the ship broke free of the storm, emerging into the cold clarity of open space. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Drake's voice came through, hoarse but alive. "Systems holding?" "Barely." Kai exhaled a shaky laugh, slumping back in his seat. "Remind me to never take your gambles again, Commander." Victor's voice was quieter now, tinged with something that might have been respect. "They'll remember this. All of them." Elias leaned back, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his gaze unyielding. Through the viewport, the void stretched out before them, vast and unbroken. The artifact's glow had faded, its power spent, but the mark it had left was indelible. "They'll remember," Elias said softly, his voice carrying a weight that hung in the air long after he'd spoken. "And so will we."